we're going to start this second session. Thank you very much, the previous speaker, for a very rich discussion. Many messages, water-related shocks are already visible in macroeconomics, including inflation and economic growth. This risk interact with climate and natural risk in ways that amplify uncertainty, creating many tensions that translating through the multitude of transition channels. And they raise difficulty questions for policy frameworks that we are not designing with water in mind. In addition, the substantial importance of water when we are talking about resilience or when we are talking about competitiveness. But now, we are going to discuss in the real world the sectoral impact of all these things, and with that in mind, I'm pleased to give the floor to Joe Ray from CDP. Joe.
Thank you, Juan Carlos, and thank you for hosting us in this exceptionally beautiful venue. I hope everybody enjoyed their coffee break. Welcome back. We heard this morning about the importance of getting to grips with the real economy and the real economy shocks and the transmission mechanisms through which those shocks translate into material, financial, and ultimately financial stability risk. So in this next panel, we're going to be really drilling down from that real economy perspective and asking, where are these real economy risks materializing? What are the most important transmission channels for that risk, both across the real economy and vertically, ultimately up into the financial system? And also, most importantly, a little bit of a solution emphasis here. What is it that governments, companies, financial institutions can and can't do to mitigate these risks and build resilience? A few quick points that I wanted to highlight from recent CDP data, which I think are pertinent just for setting the scene for today's discussion. And the first of these is to reiterate what Nicholas said this morning about new LSE analysis of CDP data, which found that when you use real company data to estimate sector-level risk exposure, rather than just using that sector-level estimation as a proxy for water dependency and risk, the risk actually looks larger. So in other words, the models that we have, wonderful though they are in fact, it seems, underestimating the reality of dependency and by extension risk. And what I also found very striking from that analysis is that, and this is hot off the press, I mean, I think it was just yesterday that the report on this was finalized, so very topical and timely, the variation within sectors is really significant. So some companies may be in a highly water dependent sector, but have much more substantial mitigation and resilience measures in place. Other companies may be much more exposed, and there's real variation within sectors as well. So I think both of these findings just point to the need for granular company-level data, and also, I think that's a topic that we will all be diving into over the course of the next hour or so. One final data point that I think is relevant here from the CDP 2025 data set. Supply chain visibility for companies is improving, but it's still inadequate. So on the improvement front, we've seen an increase from 70 to 78% year on year between 2024 and 25 of companies telling CDP when they disclose on water that they map their supply chains. Now that's really important. We think that 8% increase is quite significant, but of those 78% who say, yes, we map our supply chains, or we are planning to map our supply chains, 3/4 are only mapping their direct suppliers. And as we all know, if your direct supplier is a contractor or an intermediary who is then sourcing from a region of very high water dependency, water stress, then you lack that visibility as a company. So I think the supply chain angle is something that we're going to have to come back to a few times, because it's really critical as one of those transmission mechanisms through which shocks can become financial stability considerations. The other way of looking at that, of course, is that 1 in 5 companies are not mapping their supply chains. And it does beg the question of, well, how exposed are some companies that just lack that knowledge, perhaps lack the capacity, the understanding of their level of water risk exposure. And final point on this is to remember that these stats are from a sample of 10,000 companies, both SMEs and large corporates, who disclosed to CDP on water in 2025. That's still only a subset of the wider economy. So this is, in some respects, a self-selecting sample of the already, let's say, somewhat enlightened on water risk and dependency. And so again, the reality of broader risk exposure, as the models suggest, is potentially really, really substantial. So lots to get into here. The good news is we have another stellar panel who are going to help us unpack and make sense of all of this. Joining us online, welcome Yuvan. I hope you can hear us well. Yuvan Bejadur is Senior Advisor to the Secretary General of the World Trade Organization. Amy Laws is Head of Sustainability Science and Innovation at Microsoft. Eduardo Nali heads the Water and Sanitation Department at BNDES, Brazil's main development bank. Concepcion Marcuelo Olone is Coordinator of International Water Affairs at the Ministry for the Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge here in Spain. And last but certainly not least, we have Andrew Roby, Senior Water Security Advisor at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK. Final housekeeping note, this session is being recorded, so what you say will be on the record. Welcome to those of you joining us online. I'm going to throw a question at each of our panelists. I'm going to invite them to take about 4 minutes or so to answer. Then we'll move into a more interactive conversation with another round of questions, and rest assured you will also have your opportunity to get stuck into the conversation. We'd like to open this out to the room towards the end. So, Andy, if I may, I'll come to you first. You're behind one of the UK government's flagship water programs, and I think one of the great novelties, if I may say, of that program is the emphasis on supply chains and the need to build water security and resilience using supply chains as a leverage, as an entry point. Can you tell us a bit more about the thinking behind that work and why, in particular, supply chains are such an important consideration?
Thanks, Joe. And great to be here. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Kate Lamb, who's lurking behind, who was one of the other instigators of this Fair Water Footprint initiative. I guess I came into this water business from a very different start point, which was forestry and timber and illegal logging, some work in Indonesia, using supply chains and demand to make a big difference. And we did make a big difference. It took 15 years of my life to do that, including 9 years in country. And I think that was part of the inspiration for this supply chain approach on water. But of course, water is very different from timber. It moves, and this concept of virtual water, water that's embedded in something, I think the easiest equivalent to that is carbon, and the way carbon is embedded into products. So the classic one of a cup of coffee being 200 liters of water, all through the supply chain, consumed to make that product. But we called it fair because it's got to be just, it's got to be equitable, what we're doing. It's not just about a flow of products into a marketplace at a decent price. And that's really important. And I wanted to come back to that at the end of this, because I think we mustn't lose sight of justice in this very unjust world. And the way that results, in this case, people not having enough water, moving and becoming a migration issue, and then a source of instability. So let's not forget that source of instability that then impacts markets and economies, as we know from the Straits of Hormuz and the Iran war. So we formed the Glasgow Fair Water Footprints in COP26. It is a partnership, and that's what we're hoping to come from this room, I think, a partnership on central banks. But for us, it was a partnership of businesses, government, and civil society, supported by academics to identify, disclose, collectively manage water in supply chains. So we've started that work a couple of years ago, and we've deepened that understanding. And maybe some central banks could join us. We would love to have them. And where we've found awareness greatest has been in the food sector, naturally, but also textiles and in mining. And to be honest, I wish we'd looked at services a bit more, things like AI and the energy side. But we are where we are. So certainly fresh fruit and vegetables within the food sector is probably one of the most aware bits of the food supply chain, where we've got scarcity, flooding, and pollution. And often it's groundwater that's been the source of water, and that's gone. It's been under-regulated. In fact, there is an issue here about illegal water abstraction. And does your business want to be associated with that in the supply chain? But to get blueberries in our yogurts in the UK, we depend very heavily on water-scarce parts of the world, like Spain. We source a lot from Spain and Morocco and Peru. 78% of our imports of fruit and vegetables come from water-scarce countries. So we've got a national food security issue with climate change making man's management worse. And we've seen that with Morocco. We didn't have enough tomatoes last year because of some floods and droughts in Morocco. Then on to textiles. We've looked at Bangladesh, where there's a lot of awareness of the issues of water because, again, groundwater has disappeared at a rate of meters per year. That was the source. And, of course, the pollution that's come from the textiles industry there has been great. And then mining, naturally, it splits into two very neatly. The big companies that are generally very concerned about water and have a half-decent water standard. And then the other half of our supplies that come from artisanal sources and are pretty much uncharted. And so for awareness, there's good awareness in those areas. We've had engagement with supermarkets and now with growers, and I think there's a lot of work to be done. And yes, there is action happening in the Suez Massa in Morocco, where they basically ran out of groundwater a few years ago, and they have a great big dam up the front. We are doing some collective action work, and I think this is a key thing to come to. Individual farmers can't solve this problem, neither can retailers or anybody else in the supply chain. It needs a collective action approach. And have we got the tools to do that? Water stewardship standard at the moment does not have a collective action standard. Very few of the standards in agriculture have a collective action element. And in fact, this is something that we hope to be working on going forward. Thanks, Joe.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andy. And I may come back to you on the collective action piece, because collective action sounds great in theory, but which actors are acting where and under what incentives are the key questions for that. And I know that's something the water stewardship community are really wrestling with, but is there a way that we can bring financial sector actors into these collective action initiatives that have been corporate-led and implemented so far? Concita, maybe I can come to you and just continuing on the supply chain theme that Andy referenced. So from the Spanish government's perspective, what do you see as the main disruptions when it comes to water? And in particular, what are the implications for supply chains that are actually rooted here in Spain but have implications elsewhere?
I will. I'm a bit new in this sort of debate of try to bridge the gap between the water dialogues and the financial dialogues. So I am an engineer, always working with water, so I hope to provide something useful here. For this first round, and regarding your question, I think that, well, as a main idea, I would like to share that we have Spain. I think that we can say that we have a solid institutional and technical base in the field of water resources management. And we think that the real challenge is no longer to identify the risk or no longer to put all the efforts in identifying the risk, but to execute the investments and transformations required by the new ecosystem, a new climate-related reality with sufficient speed at an adequate scale. I will provide some 3 messages. My director always says that smart people give their main ideas in 3 messages. I will do the same. As message first, I would like to share that Spain is based on robust water governance, and I think that robust water governance is key for bridging the gap in providing more water to more, or to providing water to all people. So as I said before, we have a consolidated framework. Technically, I could say technically advanced hydrological planning or water resources management planning, and a good institutional framework based on water management at river basin scale, and depending on the ministry, on our Directorate General. And this planning process allocates water. Our legal framework commits to the planning process to allocate water to the socioeconomic sectors. No? So in connection with the economy and the supply chain, our legal framework attributes to hydrological planning the responsibility of making water allocation under different scenarios, levels of warranties, and reliability of supply. And this decision respect a precondition of to keep the ecological flows according to the standards. The standards issues is very important as well, and also the treaties with the neighbor countries, in particular with Portugal. And this hydrological planning, I think it is worthwhile to say that is integrated into risk management in draft risk management plans and flood risk management plans. So in this part, okay, we are good. But now disruption are already there, they have a cascading effect. So we have an increased frequency and an intensity of droughts and floods that we are suffering as water resources managers. And climate change is impacting the way that we have to manage the water cycle. And it's been transforming the way that water has to be allocated to the different sectors. So, and it's not only when we say it's in the water-stressed basins. No, I will provide you with an example. For instance, the drought of the 2023, which impacted many areas of Spain, but in the Ebro Basin, which is northeast of Spain, is not water-scarce country, a water-scarce basin, but it has a real impact, a very important impact in the sectoral allocation and in the water management. So this drought was a warning sign of the water stress creating effects on irrigation, energy, supply, the local economy in general. And after the end of the hydrological year in October 2024, and after the rainfalls of that, the end of the year, there was only 5% of the total capacity in our reservoirs. So there were still 3.5 million people in municipalities in emergency situation, and some 100,000 people suffering from cuts of supply, problems due to lack of infrastructure reliance. So we also found out that the relevance of communication and transparency with users, institutional coordination, and the involvement of the affected sectors, the people who were directly affected, was highlighted as important to be more reliant and to make more reliance. It's not only infrastructural problems, but also a question of better governance problem as well. And as the third message, and it will be linked, I hope to be linked to the second round of question, is the most, I think, underestimated risk or not, but it's the gap between planning and execution, the investment execution. So in this planning cycle from 2022 to 2027, we have a lot of measures, more than 6,000 measures for achieving the objectives of the planning process. We have a planned investment, huge plan, investment of more than 20 billion euros, but the problem is that there is a low execution of these investments along the cycle. And this is joined that the assessments that we have received recently say that we have a gap of investment of more than 100 billion euros in the next decade. So this is real, a real issue, a real gap that increases the exposure of critical infrastructures, such as our dams and drainage systems, and amplifies the economic and territorial impact. So for the moment, I will share more afterwards.
Wonderful. Thank you, Conchita. And I think that hosting this whole conversation in a country that is, on the one hand, extremely advanced in its understanding and planning for risk mitigation and resilience building, I think it's wonderful. And at the same time, we're confronted with the reality that such an advanced economy with such advanced measures in place is nevertheless vulnerable to hydrological shocks, both in terms of floods and droughts and extreme weather events. And so, yeah, thank you for setting out the Spanish government's position on that. We haven't yet spoken much about major industrial water users who are such key players in this whole conversation and who are increasingly both understanding their water risks, but also increasingly visible and in some respects in the firing line in terms of public perception and policy perception as well. Amy, you're Head of Sustainability, Science and Innovation at Microsoft, and so you no doubt hear the words data centers and water use many times every day. Thank you for joining us. What I'd really like to ask here is, how does the obvious dependency that a major tech company like Microsoft has on water, particularly from that data center perspective, how does awareness of that dependency influence the investment decisions, the CapEx decisions, the asset locating decisions that a company like Microsoft makes?
Great, thanks, Joe, and thanks for having me. Great discussion. So water is a critical issue for Microsoft and the tech company, as it is for really all sectors of the world, and is becoming an increasingly important issue, both because of the growth of our industry and our sector, but also because we recognize that water is becoming an increasingly big stress around the world. So in terms of how we think about where and how we invest in water in the context of these changes, I'd break it down into 3 areas. One is in the context of what we do in the data center. The other is what we do in the context of where data centers we operate data centers. And the third is our supply chain. So let me start with the operations within data centers. And this is really a lot about innovation, and there's been a tremendous change over the last decade in this space. For example, our most recent data center design are essentially zero water cooling, and cooling is the vast majority of the water used in data centers, virtually all of it. And so right now, data centers, it's really a design choice for us whether we use water or not, and where would be appropriate to do so. In the context of where we operate, and that's a different issue, right? So as we said, and as this group certainly knows, water scarcity is becoming an incredible stress in many places in the world, and including where data centers are operating. And that's why we're really investing in focusing on developing water-positive growth. Now, in 2020, Microsoft actually made a commitment to become water-positive enterprise-wide. So at an enterprise-wide level, we would replenish more water than we use. And recently, and in part because of the expansion of AI and the rapid infrastructure growth, have recognized that we need to not just think about that from a corp-wide level, but we have to think about that really in locations where we operate. Now, we always did this in the context of, in the corp-wide level, we focused on replenishing in the most water-stressed regions in the world that were informed by where we operate, but not necessarily tied exactly to where we operate. And now, in January, we launched what we call the Community First Infrastructure Initiative. And with that, what we're really doing is focusing on, okay, let's go to those communities where we operate, where we didn't see as much of a problem in resources early on when we were smaller, and understand what are the challenges and what are the opportunities for us to be able to be resource positive in those regions. So in water, what that means is a real increasing focus on replenishment projects that go specifically to the municipal water source. Because most data centers actually draw water, not all, but most data centers draw water from municipal water sources. And so the issue in terms of water that's used at data centers for cooling is, well, if we're taking it from there, what can we do to improve and reduce the water, save water, add water to those water systems? Sometimes that includes investing in recycled water, improving access and increasing access to recycled water. But increasingly, we're also focusing on addressing and reducing water leaks. So, for example, we work with a number of companies. One example is with Phytotech, which is a company that uses AI to use acoustics to find where the biggest water leaks are, and then help direct investments to address those leaks. And this is an important context to think about. So take Phoenix, for example. In Phoenix, if you do a rough estimate of all the data centers in Phoenix, and you look at how much water they use for cooling in the data centers and compare it to water leaks, it turns out it's about 6% of the water that is lost in a year in water leaks in the city. So if you had a system where all the data centers and really all the companies that come in had to invest in just solving those leaks and had a system where we could do that in a coordinated way, it's pretty easy to imagine that from an operational standpoint, from the municipal water system, we could be a net positive as an industry and as a community, as businesses going in. So thinking about those structures, I think, is really important. Now let me turn to the supply chain. And for the supply chain, for the tech sector, of course, there are two areas, chips and energy. And for energy, we all have that problem, right? Unfortunately, still, most of the energy systems in the world are very water intensive. And so whenever you turn on your lights, whenever you use energy in the electricity system, we are drawing water. And that's something that, of course, we can change in the context of moving for renewables, and that's certainly something, an area that we're investing in, but is a broader systemic challenge for the whole society and a reason for us to be investing beyond just climate in renewable energy. And in chips, the issue is innovation, again, in terms of, coming back to what I was saying, one of the things that was driving us internal to our industry. There has been a lot of innovation in this space. There is an increasing amount of circularity in water systems. Chips do need pure water, so that adds a complexity to this. But I think there's a lot of advances that are happening, and there can be incentives and drivers to do more than that. And the one other addition I would add to this, because I think that there's, as you say, there is a lot of attention on this area, is this distinction between the water in the municipal, solving the water in the municipal and solving the water in non-municipal areas. Now, of course, I'm trained as a hydrologist originally, so I understand that these are all connected. But when you think of the problems in these different peaks and in the timelines of the challenges of the watershed problem and the local problem, the hyperlocal problem, I think this distinction of the challenge, how we're addressing a challenge is from the municipal and the watershed is really important, and something that we're really focused on now as we think about and begin to address water and other resource issues from this sort of community-first space approach.
Thanks, Amy. Some really interesting reflections there, and a few things that we can follow up on, particularly on the supply chain piece, because you're right that obviously zero water is now an option. It's a technical option for cooling, but it's not an option for energy generation and chip manufacturing, right? So arguably the dependencies are greater upstream than they are necessarily on the cooling front, but it's cooling that is easy to understand and which can be picked up by the media and which has helped to generate so much momentum and attention around data center water footprints. So really interesting reflections there, thank you. I actually want to bring in Eduardo here, and then Yuvan will come to you directly afterwards. But Eduardo, just staying with the investment theme, so you represent Brazil's main development bank. Just interested to see from your perspective, sort of what are you seeing on the ground when it comes to financing projects and initiatives in Brazil, which are critical for economic growth and resilience, but have a high water impact and dependency? And any reflections you want to share from your direct experience at country level?
Thank you, Joe. First of all, I would like to thank for the invite. I'm very glad to be here and be part of such an important discussion. I'll try to focus on Brazil and what BNDES is doing. BNDES, the major development bank in Brazil. Look, the Brazilian economy is highly dependent on water. Every economy is, but especially Brazil. because of our hydropower generation, our strong agriculture, our industry, our big cities, and a relevant part of our infrastructure also. So what's changing is that water is no longer only an environmental issue. Now water is about financial risks. When you look to the past, a few years ago, and you talk to a company, water risks for them, and for the banks also, for BNDES also, was only a reputational risk. So talking about water risks was just a beautiful speech. Now things have changed. So it's about resilience, it's about adaptation, it's about continuity, it's about profitability. So things have changed in Brazil. For example, in agriculture, you are concerned about the changes of rainfall patterns and droughts. On power generation, also droughts, and if the system is resilient in case of a long and severe drought. We are concerned about the competition between industry use of water and the human consumption that obviously is priority. So what BNDES is doing is changing the way we analyze the project. So of course the financial issues are important, the traditional financial issues are important, but we added in our analysis some water-related risks and climate change risks. So we analyze where the projects are inserted, where the companies are inserted, if the project or the company faces any kind of vulnerability in this theme, the intense use of the water, and for that we use two major tools in the bank. One georeferential tools that identifies where the project is, in which ecosystem it's inserted, in order to see if it's in any kind of sensitive area, for example, Ramsar areas. And the other one is Adapta Brasil. Adapta Brasil is a tool developed by the Brazilian Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation that projects climate change impacts in all the cities, municipalities in Brazil up to 2050, sorry. So it's not about the present anymore, it's about the future. And BNDES also analyzes the capacity of the companies to identify and mitigate these water-related risks. And if we identify that the company doesn't have the capacity to manage, we try to build a solution together. So what we see now in Brazil is that companies finally understand the issue, they agree to find solutions, and they are willing to build solutions with us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eduardo. And I think it's just interesting to hear you talk about water being treated as a resilience and adaptation issue, and what was once a corporate social responsibility sort of framing, and as you say, a nice speech to make with polite applause at the end, is now a much more material and integral issue to some very important economic conversations, not least the one we're having today. I want to just take this up one level to the trade system, because of course supply chains don't exist in a vacuum. They are influenced by and have influence on trade routes globally and interact with trade policy, which of course is in turn heavily influenced by geopolitical change, geopolitical rupture even. Yuvan, first question to you is, do you hear us well?
I can hear you well.
Excellent. Second question to you, Yuvan. You have a front row seat to some of the trade disruption and challenges, but also opportunities that our current sort of geopolitical climate is creating. I'm interested to know, from the World Trade Organization perspective and from your very unique vantage point there, where are the most consequential pressure points when it comes to water? And just to contextualize that a little bit, Prisoners of Geography is on all the bestseller lists again now, and you can pick it up in any airport you go through. Geography is back in vogue, and we're all acutely aware of the pressure points in the global energy markets. very interested in your take on any water parallels, some of which may be increasingly well understood, but others of which may still be flying under the radar.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. And let me first thank the OECD, Lila Davis, my colleague, the Bank of Spain, for organizing this wonderful session, and the CDP, of course. Joe, thank you very much. And my apologies for not being able to be with you, and even more, my apologies to have a larger Claude Monet painting instead of the beautiful Goya and Picasso paintings in the Bank of Spain, but that was not intended. Happy International Tea Day as well. I mean, one single cup of black tea, because of the growing, the processing, the brewing, requires 30 liters of water. So I just wanted to put that as a small point to kick off the conversation. But I think, Joe, one of the key issues we're seeing is that right now industrial policy, the industrial policy wave that we're seeing, is creating a concentration risk that will surely land on the sovereign balance sheets of central banks. We've seen from the G7 to the G20, all the major industrial countries, industrialized nations, are running an industrial policy which is designed to really onshore industries of the future. Semiconductors, critical minerals, AI infrastructure, clean energy, and you name it. The CHIPS Act of the US, but also French shoring mandates that we're seeing and strategies are really, in a way, dressed a bit in the language of national security, and some more, some less. But what does that really mean? I mean, I think that what really means now, especially now, considering also the impacts of the Strait of Hormuz closure, is that you're going to see much more of the trade being reconfigured and being rerouted with new shipping lanes and new trade routes. And that's already happening. You're seeing more pressure from Hormuz, which is blocked, to other choke points, whether it be Malacca, whether it be the Sea of, the different seas that we know, Malacca, Bourbon. What does that mean? That means, I think, that the semiconductors that we are seeing, that the fertilizers that are being produced, the manufactured goods that still use water, and oftentimes in water-stressed areas and hubs and global markets, are not necessarily being factored into these analysis and those analytics. We know, for example, that from some of the work that we're doing, that a price average of 90 barrels a barrel this year, we forecast that merchandise trade will slow to 4.1%. And that in 2027, the figures will be 2.8% and 5.2% respectively. So my point is that as these pressure points increase, as those dependencies move from place to place, central bankers and central banks, who have often been extremely helpful. I mean, I remember my time at the World Bank, where we worked very closely with ministries of finance and central banks to really look at the price of carbon, to really look at carbon emissions, to look at financing mechanism instruments for forestry. But we haven't really looked at it as much, I would say, for water. And we know that this transition, and oftentimes it's taken 10 years or more to make that transition to a green economy and to really looking at water as a macro critical issue, will have huge financial costs on the economy, will have implications for jobs and for development. So where are those points? I think one of them is, as I mentioned, is this wave of industrial policy, which is really creating water concentration risks. And it's not just water which is concentrated. The financial system is over-concentrated in some ways. Critical supply chains are very concentrated as well. So I think there's a need to really see how we deconcentrate these. How do you look for water in places which are more abundant? Because I think Andrew mentioned it. A lot of the developed countries are pulling the resources from where it's really scarce, whether it be the vegetables you're using, the cotton that are being produced, the fashion industry, etc. So I think that's one key thing we need to really look at. The second point I would say is that water is totally underpriced. One of the key messages that came out of the Global Commission on the New Economics of Water, which Dr. Ngozi, my boss, co-chaired alongside Mariana Mazzucato, Johan Rockström, and President Thurman of Singapore, was to show that water is not only a global public good, but it's also vastly underpriced. And I think central bankers are extremely well placed to look at the issues that are very relevant to that, whether it be inflation, whether it be unemployment that might come in the future, whether it be macroeconomic instability, and how do you ensure that the configuration we can build for the future, the models that central bankers build for the future, really look at more stress water tests, really look at the NGFS scenario architecture and look at it from a very robust way, a very ecosystem way. The prudential capital assessments that some of you guys are doing is not seen as a sensitivity, but as a core variable. So let me just give these 2 points. So water as underpriced, and the choke points that we're seeing only requires us, and I'll mention that in the next few points when we talk about it, is how can the trading system really be a cushion for more trade resilience for those choke points of the future? Because I think a reformed trading system can really help in some of these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Lots to get into there, some really interesting reflections. I think that point that trade is not neutral, when it comes to water security and resilience, it is either advantageous or disadvantageous, or in most cases a combination of the two. But as we see this trade flow realignment, which is being driven by geopolitical change, the impacts will not be neutral. My fear, particularly as somebody sort of trained in political science and international relations, is that actually in many security and trade policy forums and arenas, the environment more broadly and water as part of that is at risk of being subordinated to shorter-term strategic security concerns. And I think that is something that those of us who care about and understand the implications of water risk and dependency for macro criticality need to continue to make the case for. So some really interesting reflections there. Thank you, Ivan. I wonder, Andy, if I could come back to you and just sort of moving the conversation on towards a bit more of a solution emphasis. Fair water footprints, as part of the broader Just Transitions for Water Security program that FCDO is running, is an attempt to address some of these unsustainable trade footprints from the perspective of a sort of enlightened self-interest. It's not traditional development programming of the sort where you are out, in a developing country necessarily just seeking, development as an end in itself, but there is also a quite sort of hard-headed, almost national security-oriented, self-interested supply chain resilience lens that can be applied. Is that something that you could speak a little bit further to? Also keeping in mind that the UK National Security Council has released recently a review of our dependency on supply chains, which in turn depend on ecosystem services.
And that's a really good place to start, that UK awareness of the national security risk of nature loss. And that report, as you rightly said, came out in March and identified very clearly that, our defense, the defense of the realm, the prime responsibility of government was actually being undermined by nature loss, not just in the UK, but particularly through food supply chains in other countries. So we have this collective responsibility, this collective challenge. And just thinking about what Yuval was saying about trade, I think there's a role here for something close to the things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism for water. This is perhaps a bit of a jump, but if you're looking at how water is included in trade at the moment, it doesn't exist in any of the trade agreements that I've looked at. And yet it's fundamental to the sustainability of that trade agreement because we're looking at materials, and it could be just metals and chips. We're all very into those at the moment going forward, but it will be increasingly food and other dependencies. Where is the water scarcity included in that? And so chapters in trade agreements. And we can start small with this. And just to come to a couple of countries where we're working, Malawi and Morocco, two very different countries, but both water scarce, both very vulnerable, one with very poor sort of high poverty levels, Morocco much, much better off. The program that we've developed around fair water footprints One element of it is national policy, is looking at resilience and national policy lens, coming in through national adaptation plans and the UNFCCC. John Matthews is here in the room, who's led the Water Resilience Tracker. When you get national policy right, that should be steering how investments are made, and actually what central banks do, and what treasuries do, and all the departments. The issue we've had is that water's been siloed into an infrastructure project rather than taking the environmental broader view of things. So we're helping Morocco and Malawi do that, Brazil too, there's a number of other countries. And then at the other end, you've got, how's the investment going to happen? And the last 3 days here in Spain, you've been looking at this. And again, we've very much focused on water utilities, a supply service issue, whereas we've not been dealing with the nature crisis, which is ultimately going to undermine all of our supplies for whatever source you're talking about. And how are we going to, those benefits, those flows of benefits that we all perceive but don't pay for? These are not just a pricing of water issue, it's a pricing of all the other environmental services that we derive because water is there. We have to be smart and start to create some new markets, as we've done for carbon. Carbon is ultimately something that you and I don't pay for, right, as individuals, but we are now paying for it in all sorts of different ways, in the way that we're investing in renewables, for instance, and things like that. So I'm looking at this, long term, and you're right, Joe. At the moment, governments are very short term, and we're looking at, and the political cycle doesn't help. We're on 3 to 5 year political cycles, sometimes less in our case, where you get a change of government all of a sudden and a change of direction. But undermining most of this is the fact that we use discounted cash flow for our economic calculations, which discounts the future. We need to have another look at this. I know I go on about this at every opportunity, but we are using the wrong economic tools to assess investment publicly. And I think that runs through the boardroom into the way that our businesses operate.
But is there, just to make this very practical and concrete and taking advantage of the folks we have in the room, is there any particular sort of call to action that you would want to sort of put out today in terms of that collective action piece and moving beyond, just a few front runners working on this, but actually something broader and more collective?
I think signals that come from central banks are obviously something that finance directors and chief executives look at very closely. So when the governor of a bank, central bank, says, for instance, that climate change is a soft risk, that sends a signal that we don't really care. We must be aware that that language is picked up and converted into investment decisions. So it's getting that language aligned. And I know this network of green financial systems is looking at that alignment, and I'm looking to that to create some signals, governors speaking collectively. We are, for our sins, presiding over the G20 next year, and we're wondering whether nature and water has something that we can do together as the G20 on this. We're not sure, but it would be great. If we had a signal from the governors of the NGFS banks, that would be very powerful.
Just in terms of signals and that corporate policy interface, Amy, perhaps I can bring you back in here. I think we all know that the private sector moves at a speed that policy is rarely able to match. I think that's a given. From the perspective of a major tech player that is at the forefront of so much cutting-edge innovation and investment and capex and water dependency and is really a system player at this point, are there sort of one or two calls to action that you would make for policymakers, financial regulators, in terms of helping to bridge some of the gaps between where the corporate world is now when it comes to water risk and dependency and the state of our current regulation and policy?
So I think that the biggest challenges that constrain corporate's ability to move to this water positive approach that I think that is possible is one is data, and this is something that the water community certainly understands as a challenge, but it's interesting because I'm very aware of this in the context of trying to think about what is the water context of and ecosystem context. It's something that my team's really focused on, of all the different places we work on, to really to understand what is happening and what can we do and what is a new development going to mean in that region. And it's so interesting because there's a real push for data centers to disclose, and we have committed to do that in a much more granular way, which will be coming out soon as a part of our Community First initiative. But the interesting thing is it's incredibly hard to get information about water from any industry and any sector to just put this in context. And I think that is a really important thing to understand where a company is coming into, like who are our collaborators in this space working in the basin, and what are they doing, and how can we connect with them? The other part of data, of course, is also understanding the risks in that region. I think we have arguably, in some ways, a better understanding of those, although not at a level that's never necessarily operational. Which brings me to the second point of areas where I think government and banks, financial institutions too, can help. Is it's very difficult right now to figure out where companies should invest to have the biggest impact and be most positive in a region. And part of that decision is based on the hydrology, the regulation of the place. In some places it's very complicated, right? So you can invest in this area, but because of the regulatory system on the water, it might not have the impact because of constraints. So a lot of time is spent and money is spent trying to figure out what's the best investment, and perceptions in the community is also important and will always remain important. You know, it's science-based targets, science-based investments, right? But it becomes really difficult to find the best place to put funds. And if there could be a system and a structure, and I even, really believe that we can set up a system that says, in every municipality, any company that comes in, you have to pay into this fund to address all the leaking pipes, or to do this, and to even out that system and really solve the problems together and just make it easy to do that. And the third area, and it might seem like an odd thing to present in the government and financial systems, but I do think education is important. And it's not so much, I've also worked in water work on climate and ecosystems as well, but in water for sort of my whole life is, before it was just understanding where does your water come from. Water is important, it's scarce, but I think now, in terms of the type of education that I think is really important, is understanding focusing on what are the problems to solve, right? I sometimes say, we're fighting the wrong fight so often, I see, and it's wasting energy, it's wasting money, and if we could figure out and get people to really focus on these are the areas in these regions, and water, as we know, is a local issue, and that means that in the basins and the sub-basins, we have to be able to understand what are those problems and what are the fights to fight, because I think sometimes now the discussion is missing the solution, and if we focus on instead trying to get together on the solution, we will stop talking past each other in this, emerging and evolving crisis.
No more red herrings. I do have a few follow-up questions for our other panelists, but we've got about 15 minutes left, and I promised participants here would have an opportunity to get stuck in. I see 2 hands, 3 hands already at the back. Do we have a microphone going around? Or not? give them a moment. Hands up again, please. Yep. Gentleman at the back. Yep. Yes.
Hello. I'm Noel Mary from the IFC, part of the World Bank Group. So I think the gentleman online has mentioned something which is very interesting that we've not touched yet, which is water is underpriced. And I guess the whole fragility of the system is something that we don't mention, but is water tariff. We know they are low, even though we also know, I mean, low tariff hurts the poor, but the whole fragility of the system financially, and the system that is already under stress. So even under bigger stress now with climate change, because investments that were not made and resilience adaptation to the water system and infrastructure is getting even more complicated because the system is already in deficit. So you look at public expenses, they are not enough to increment access and to get to the SDGs, obviously. I mean, and we're getting way behind. But still, the tariffs are remaining low, and regulators and the governments are still not looking at increasing the tariff, which has then the consequences on supply chain, etc. I mean, we had Irene from Costa Rica this morning. She made a comment like, "Oh, our energy bill will increase." And it seems like, okay, it will increase, but it's quite normal. But if you say, my water bill will increase, nobody won't even say it. I mean, it's like something we don't want to talk about. And I think it's the crucial element. I mean, really, if the central banks can weigh in to make government adjusting tariffs, so not full cost recovery, which is impossible, of course, but at least to a level where the operators can supply water at a quality and quantity that is necessary, then it will decrease also the risk on the balance sheet of the banks that are lending to the water sector, and also promote more private sector participation and water operators to be more independent, more sustainable. I think it's a key element in the whole big picture. No, it will not resolve everything, but I think it's a fundamental piece that can help.
Yeah, I think we'll take that as a comment unless there's anyone on the panel who wants to react. I suppose the reality of the political economy of water is such that it will never have a global spot price as in the energy markets, and that's one of these permanent constraints that we all have to live with when it comes to water. Were there any central banks in the room who wanted to respond to that? I don't see any hands going up. Yes, Central Bank of Morocco, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you. Just to share a concrete example from a developing country, we back in 2022, we've explored with the World Bank climate and development pathway in Morocco, and as a water-stressed country, we have explored the potential of rising the prices to have a fair water price. But the problem is that you have some competing priorities in the social services, education and health. You have the major part of the population which is poor, and if you have a higher price, that would imply that you would lose some of the hardly gains on eradicating poverty. So you need to have some compensatory policies once you consider rising the prices. And it's really within the government's policies' hands that would stand, because central bank could push for that. But you need to not be in conflict with other SDGs in countries where you have a large population which is actually poor, and you need that all the benefits from rising the prices of water should be translated into social services benefits. And when you look at the whole policy mix, it's quite tricky and complex to really rise the prices of water. Just to share a concrete example, maybe from a more emerging developing country.
Great point. Lady here, yeah.
Good morning, I'm Sarah, I'm from the Central Bank of Brazil. The only point that I would make, adding to your comments, is that water is a universal right issue. So it changed the whole thing. So that's why most tariffs, they are subsidized in most developing nations. So it's a bit different from energy, I would say. the topic.
Radically different, right? Radically different, and that in part is the problem. We're not going to see investor capital markets price signals for water of the sort that we see around energy scarcity because of water's unique political economy and its role as a human right, indeed. Other questions? I saw there were several hands. Yes, gentleman at the back, you had your hand up first, I believe.
Thanks. Mine's a question to Eduardo, just to warn you, Eduardo. I'm picking up on Brazil. So my name is David Chubb-Jones. I'm head of resilience at the Climate Bonds Initiative, and I wanted to hear a little bit about Brazil and solutions, partly because I live in Cape Town. I've made that my home for 20-something years, and we got bailed out at day zero in the city of Cape Town by farmers who actually agreed to give up their water and give it to the city. So I heard you talk about BNDES, what you do on water and sanitation, but obviously in Brazil, a lot of what's going on that links to the water cycle is tied up in agriculture, nature as well. So what I'd like to hear is actually internally in your bank, what are the discussions you have with your colleagues at the bank who finance agriculture about solutions to things like water scarcity? And how does that actually play out, and how does that affect the financing that your bank then puts into the system, which leads to resilient solutions? Because I think Brazil is at the forefront of some of that thinking, and just from CBI's point of view, we're looking to put in a big program around resilient agriculture, but I'm a water person, so I'm quite keen to know how that all plays out. Bit selfish of me, but there you go. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Actually, Brazil is some steps back. We have 40 million people without access to drinkable water with regularity and quality. So we have huge investment to be done. We have 8 million people without access to sewage treatment. So in our estimate, we need $200 billion to reach universalization of service in sanitation. So as our colleague said, water is a universal right. So the first problem we have is to make people to have access to the water. But when you think about agriculture or the economy as a whole, of course, if water impacts agriculture, infrastructure, cities, agribusiness in general, power generation, we have to put financing inside of this. What BNDES is doing, BNDES created as environmental, social, and climate policy, and created some incentivized lines, for example, to incentivize reuse of water, restoration of forest and watersheds, relocation of sensitive assets subjected to floods, for example, like water treatment plants and sewage treatment plants. And so these incentivized lines try to change the sector as a whole. It's not for one project, it's for this sector. And the more important thing, to access this financing, the companies have to be compliant with this environmental policy of BNDES. So, as in Brazil, the interest rates are high, and we have these incentivized lines, we see things changing inside the companies. So now they're working in this issue, climate change, water-related risks, in order to access BNDES's funding. So, and I think you have some path to follow. I think we have to increase our incentivized product. We have to keep improving the way we analyze projects. Now we don't analyze only the financial issues of the project. You have to analyze the climate and the social risks of the projects. And I think in this way, providing funding, incentivized, and asking for the companies and building solutions together with the companies, we can reach the universalization, and we can provide more stability and for companies, agriculture, infrastructure, and industry.
I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Yes, gentleman here in the tan suit. Gentleman over here.
Thanks very much. My question's for Amy, and I really liked how you set out the 3 stages, but particularly on the second, on where. It'd be great to hear, and again, I want to connect it to a few other things that have been said. In terms of locations of where you may develop a data center or have a data center, could you talk a little bit about, on one hand, you're thinking about current availability of water and how that factors in, but also we heard a little bit about scenario analysis and about the supervisors and central banks is kind of your projections of how much water there would be, and thereby is there some kind of shared lessons about what you at the firm level are kind of factoring in terms of projections for the future to inform your decision today, and thereby the scenario architecture being built on one hand. And then the second is, you talked a little bit about it being very local and contextual. For me, when you said that, there's the parallels from a conservation world of FPIC, so free, prior, informed consent. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your engagement strategy. As Elias mentioned in the previous panel, ultimately, water's a finite good. Unlike energy, we're not trying to source or find more. So I guess when you're designing or developing a site, there is engagement with the local community, and whether that goes beyond, say, the planning approval or standard processes to kind of build a site. And is there an engagement strategy with the local community? Because I guess from a CDP point of view, that's something that could be disclosed via your system.
Can you answer those many questions
there's a lot
concisely?
There. So,
briefly, if you can, and then I'd like to get one more in.
Okay. Do you want to take the other one first, or no?
Sure. Yeah. Let's do that. Actually. Yeah. There was a gentleman here. Yes.
So I'm Pete Simpson from the Resilient Water Accelerator. My question's for Andy, actually. You talked about the just transition for water security. Obviously, there's 3 elements to that. About resilience, it's about fair water footprints, it's about the Resilient Water Accelerator. I'm really interested to know whether you think there's a role for any international standards to help make sense of this stuff for central banks, development banks, but also for other investors who are trying to desperately close the gap, for example, on SDG 6. So international standards, is there a role given your experience of those 3 things?
Great question. Amy, do you want to go first?
Sure. So
briefly,
there's
if you can.
Was that?
No, just briefly, if you.
Okay,
if you
briefly.
Can. Yeah, there were a lot
okay.
of questions.
So we'll talk afterwards. But I guess there's a couple of things that I would say on first of the scenarios of like where we're focusing. I would say, historically, water was not an issue. It wasn't as much of an issue in terms of where it wasn't a factor, both because it's cheap and because it wasn't a constraining issue. I would say now it is an issue in terms of thinking about trade-offs of water and energy and different issues where things are being developed. In terms of scenarios, as I said, we do have, for operational risk, we have zero water design as our new model. So that, in terms of the internal structure, is part of that scenario planning, right? And so it's not as big an issue when you move forward. But the broader issue, of course, is the scenarios when you think about the energy sector, and that we really think about through the lens of the shifting to renewables. It's kind of mixed up in our process of how do we help to decarbonize the grid and expand the grid. And I know I have to be short here, but I do think one way of thinking about the increasing electricity demand from the tech sector and driven by AI is that it is, if we use it right, it's an opportunity for a tremendous amount of investment to go to build the grid in a way that really can facilitate the energy transition and thus the water transition.
And Andy, I think it's final word. I don't want to keep people into the lunch break, so have to be concise.
Very great question, Peter. International standards, yes, absolutely. We've been working on the global goal for adaptation through UNFCCC. I think it's a part of the solution. The water resilience tracker, where that's operating in countries, that gives you assurance the country has not just thought about water risks, but integrated it into national policy. Costa Rica is a great example of that rolling through in Brazil now. Isn't that going to make that country more investable, right? If you've got those 2 things in place. There's a very human index called the Water Insecurity Index, which is about water insecurity at the domestic level. That perhaps starts to answer the FPIC question. How are people perceiving it? Because if you haven't got the people and the citizens behind it, you can't do anything with tariffs. You can't raise prices because they don't really get it. They don't understand it. And finally, the Alliance for Water Stewardship, which I think is a great but very site-specific standard. We need this turned into a collective action thing. So there's a whole basket of standards there, and I'd love to see ISO pulling that all together. Over to you, Dan.
Joe, could I have 10 seconds just to make a point on agriculture harmful subsidies? More than $800 billion a year are provided to the sector, including payments for producers, general services, consumer support. So if there's a way that leaders, including central bank governors, could work much more closer to see how we could reform the harmful agriculture subsidy sector, which is really externalizing water sector, I think that would be a great win for the multilateral trading system. Second is just very quickly on the virtual water trader. I was hoping to mention that, but I think the WTO and OECD and others could be really well placed to do much more work around virtual water trade with really robust data on where we are on trade statistics, supply chain reporting. And that could be, I think, very interesting with the work of central bankers.
All right. Thank you. You've answered. So we've covered subsidies, standards, trade, pricing, supply chains, development finance. All of these could have dedicated breakout sessions and even conferences of their own. I'm not going to attempt to summarize and synthesize it all, but we do have a wrap-up session tomorrow afternoon where we'll be teasing out all of the key messages and implications from all of these sessions. So in the interests of lunch, let's wrap it up there. Thank you all for your attention, and thanks to our wonderful panelists.